So I'm excited that we've got him here for tonight's topic. This again, we've been doing a lot of cafes recently on water and water quality here in this part of North Carolina. So this is another great event in that series. If you want to see others, check out naturalsciences.org, and you can find archived copies of all the science cafes. Find me after the show and I can get you more detailed information if you want to watch past events as well. Please put your hands together and welcome to the stage Ed Buchan.
Thanks, Chris. And just to provide a public service announcement, mountain bikes are dangerous, and that's why I'm in the predicament that I'm in now and using my mother-in-law's walker. So talk about an indignant way to get here. But I'm going to go talk about water now, something I dearly love. So what I'd like to start out with is a little bit of history that might be interesting to people that are from Raleigh, that have been here for a long time, might be interested to know, kind of where we get our water from and where we've gotten it from in the past and what our plans are in the future. So with that, I'm going to start with what a water and sewer utility does. And I'm with the City of Raleigh, formerly known as the Public Utilities Department. Now we're trying to rebrand to kind of make things a little more easier for people to understand. We're going to be Raleigh Water. But essentially, what we do is we just move water. It's kind of like beer or coffee that you drink. You just borrow it for a little while. You don't actually get to keep it. Likewise, we just take water from a source, we treat it, we put it in a distribution system, which, by the way, has 2,600 miles of water lines. It's enough to go from here to Vegas. We get it back from you. There's a little bit we lose in irrigation, not much anymore. A little bit cooling tower loss, not much anymore either. We get it back from you through the sewer, also 2,600 miles of sewer lines. We treat it again. We treat it to almost drinking water standards, and then we put it back into the environment. So we just kind of move it around. We don't actually keep it. Actually, water conservation in a way is an interesting concept because we actually discharge more water back to our river than we take out of the river system. That's because our sewer system leaks. But usually we'll use around 50 million gallons of water a day, 51 thereabouts, and we discharge about 52. So we're not breaking the conservation of mass law. We're not making water, but we're getting a little groundwater seeping into our sewer system. And just to be clear on that, our sewer system is separate from our stormwater system, very separate. So our stormwater goes to creeks and streams, usually without treatment, and then our sewer system, it goes straight to a treatment plant. So I'll move on. That's not actually a prison. It looks like one. It is a water treatment plant from the late 1930s. It's the E.B. Bain Plant. It still stands today. We no longer own it, but it's still there. If you ever go on the Greenway between Old Fayetteville Road and I guess that's Lake Wheeler Road, you'll see it. And that was the city's first formal plant. And it's actually pretty neat. If you want to go Google it, there's some really cool pictures of it inside. A water plant used to be the sort of the centerpiece of a city. When you strip it all down, if you don't have water, I mean, even the Sumerians understood this. The rest of it's just decoration. And people knew that in the 30s, and they had really cool looking plants inside, spiral staircases. It was really cool. We moved on since then, but to follow the history of Raleigh's water, it goes back into the 1800s, 1887, when NC State was first formed, by the way, go Wolfpack. And it was owned by a private company. The city itself didn't have the financial resources to start their own water system. People used to have cisterns or wells, and that's how they got their water. In fact, there's still firefighting cisterns throughout downtown Raleigh, so that we didn't have a water system to actually fight fires, and we would just have to collect water in underground tanks. And there's one on the Capitol building to this day. So not long after that, we built Lake Raleigh, which is on Centennial Campus, still there today. Not used for water source anymore. And shortly after that, we built Lake Johnson, which of course is a great park now. Again, not a water source, but they're pretty small if you've been to them. So that gives you an idea. We didn't have much population to serve. Raleigh was still very much a sleepy little town and just wasn't growing very much. We built the Bain Plant as pictured there in the late 30s. Then we actually built some lakes in Garner. The city owned and operates those lakes still to this day, Lake Benson and Lake Wheeler. We brought those online because we were getting more people. And there was a quote that I saw in a Raleigh Times newspaper. These people probably don't know what newspapers are. It was a bicentennial, so it covered 1875 to 1925, and there was a city engineer. He covered all engineering things. He said, well, whenever we need new water, we'll just build a dam and build a lake and just get more water. As simple as that, which of course is not the case in real life, but it was back then. So that's what they did with Lake Benson and Lake Wheeler. They just said, well, we're going to put some rocks here and some dirt and build a dam. So those were the city's main water sources for a long time. And then we built the E.M. Johnson plant up in North Raleigh. If you go up Falls of Neuse Road, you can see it on your left just past Durant Road. It's been there for a long time, even longer than I've been on this planet. And that plant was originally there to take water out of the Neuse River. And that same city engineer in 1925 said, well, the Neuse River is the water panacea for Raleigh. We won't ever need any more water than that. I mean, there's no way a million people could ever live here. Turns out he's wrong. And so there used to be an intake, a run-of-the-river intake on the Neuse River. And then in the early 80s, they built Falls Lake and Lake Jordan at the same time. And a portion of that water in Falls Lake was dedicated to the city. It was actually owned and operated by the Corps of Engineers. So that was a huge boost for the city in terms of providing long-term water supply. I think even at that time we thought, I mean, I lived here during that time, plenty of water ad infinitum. No, we needed more water. So we actually had to go back to Lake Benson, which we took offline sometime in the mid-80s. We got Falls Lake, we don't need it. We had to go back to do that, and we built a new plant, which is really cool. And if you ever do a tour of a water treatment plant, that's where we'll take you because it's fancy. We built that in 2010. So that's sort of our water infrastructure history right there. But all of our water comes from the Neuse River Basin. And Raleigh is the only city with a impoundment on the Neuse River itself. Durham has two small impoundments a little bit upstream of Falls Lake, but those are smaller rivers. The Neuse River was impounded about where Falls of the Neuse Road crosses it to form Falls Lake. And one of the good and bad things about where we're at is that we're way up in the watershed. So flooding's not a big problem around here in terms of hurricanes. It can be in minor conditions, but nothing like you'll see down east. On the downside, our water catching net, our watershed that we draw from is relatively small. So, I often say that from a population standpoint, you'd be better off having 600,000 people, that's who we serve, down in Kinston, but then you have flooding issues and stuff like that. So we get all of our water from the Neuse, and we return it to the Neuse. So it's unique in that sense. We're not moving water from different river basins like Durham and Cary do. We keep it all in the Neuse River. And I mentioned already our water treatment plants. We have one in North Raleigh called the E.M. Johnson plant. That's currently having a lot of work done to it. It's old, and so we're fixing a lot of things there, and we're also expanding it to 120 million gallons. And we're in a little bit of a different situation in a lot of communities in certain parts of the country that aren't growing. We are. We're seeing about 10 to 12,000 people enter our service area every year, and it's been that way for quite a while now. So we're having to plan for that expansion as we're moving forward. And as I mentioned earlier, Dempsey Benton is in Garner, and that's the fancy plant that we'll take you to if you ever want to see a plant and hear boring people like me. A lot of people don't know that we're a regional system. We don't just serve Raleigh. We serve 6 other communities, 3 of them in the eastern part of the county, Wendell, Knightdale, and Zebulon. And we also serve Garner, Wake Forest, and Rollsville. All of those communities are growing quite a bit. And in fact, when we looked at our permits at the end of the fiscal year, we saw that for the first time in a long time, Raleigh's permits for new house construction went significantly down, whereas our satellite communities that we now serve went up quite a bit. We're still seeing a lot of people coming into Raleigh. They're just moving into multifamily residences, high-rise buildings. If you look downtown Raleigh where we're at, you see cranes everywhere. That's where people seem to be moving now in Raleigh. But in Wendell, for instance, they're moving into single-family homes, just as they did in Raleigh in the 80s and 90s. And I should also mention that these communities for a long time didn't have the same rates as a Raleigh customer. If you live in Raleigh, you paid for a long time less per month than these folks did. The issue was that the state of North Carolina and pretty much everybody wanted to regionalize water distribution. The reality is most small communities do not have the financial wherewithal and the ability to operate and maintain a water and sewer system, period. And a lot of communities throughout North Carolina and the rural areas are losing population, and they've got really old stuff. So they're really in a bad way. So this was sort of a deal that was fostered by Wake County and North Carolina, and we merged utilities. We took over the utility for Garner, for Wendell, and so on. Invariably, those systems were dilapidated in bad shape. So essentially, rather than having Raleigh ratepayers, which are you guys, pay for those repairs, we had those folks living in those communities pay extra on their water bill. To this day, Zebulon's average utility bill is probably $125, $150 a month. That's not uncommon, and that's sort of the grim future for a lot of places, quite frankly. But as they pay off their repairs needed for their systems, then their rates return to what Raleigh rates are. So that's how we've done it here. We're the second largest utility in North Carolina, about 600,000 people, and again, fast growing. Charlotte's a little bit bigger than us, and they're also a regional utility serving people in Mecklenburg and outside of Mecklenburg County. This is the three legs of the water provider stool, and they're all equally important, I would argue. But I'm going to go through each one of them very quickly about what we do when we think about quantity, quality, and infrastructure. So this is a profile of Falls Lake, and most people don't realize that Falls Lake is first and foremost not owned by Raleigh. We have a contract with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to withdraw a certain amount of water from that lake every day. But it's built for a lot of different purposes, recreation, water quality, wildlife habitat. And arguably most important to a lot of people is flood control. Prior to Lake Jordan and Falls Lake being constructed, hurricanes that came to the central part of the state would drop a lot of rain here and have devastating effects in communities in Fayetteville and, of course, Kinston and Goldsboro and places like that. So they built it to capture some water. And so that's the big red piece of it right there, is the lake is there used to capture a lot of flood water. And they can release that water later after the flood waters downstream have passed by. At full pool, when the lake is full, it's at 251.5 feet above Wrightsville Beach, so mean sea level. And it's not far off of that right now, oddly enough. This is kind of unusual for this time in September. But the way the lake is managed is the green and the yellow box. It's kind of like a checking account. So if Raleigh withdraws 40 million gallons of water a day from the lake, it comes out of the water supply storage, the green box. If the Corps of Engineers releases 70 million gallons of water for downstream needs, it comes out of the yellow box. And then if you get let's say a 3-inch rain and the lake fills up, a couple inches, then they divide that volume by a certain percentage. And prior to March of this past year, that percentage was roughly 58% went into the yellow box, and the other 42% went to the green box, us. Through literally an act of Congress, which is quite an accomplishment, takes a long time, we essentially went with the Corps of Engineers and said, we're going to need more water. Our options are building another reservoir, and quite frankly, there's not many places to build reservoirs in North Carolina left. All the good ones have been taken. So, and we were planning on building one in eastern North Carolina called the Little River Reservoir near Rollsville. And the price tag last I saw was $300 million, and it wasn't a very big source, quite frankly. So instead of that, we were able to work with the Corps and our legislative leaders to essentially, through a paper exchange, switch that percentage. We were able to generate a hydrologic model that showed we could still meet those downstream needs if we just switched the percentages so that our green box got bigger by roughly 4.1 billion gallons. And again, there's no partitions in the lake. If you go to the lake, there's not like a big Raleigh side, downstream side. It's not there. But we switched them. And so we now have, without having to lift a finger, other than to sign something, another 4.1 billion gallons. So essentially you're taking advantage of a hole in the ground that was already there. And that's a huge cost savings to us and provides us roughly enough water to get to 2045, thereabouts. So that was a big boon for the city. And but even though we're looking at 2040, 2045 and beyond, we have to already start thinking about the next one. And again, people would get questions about, what about Lake Jordan? Well, Lake Jordan's in a different basin. And generally speaking, North Carolina frowns deeply about moving water between basins. So we got the water we got, and we got to figure out how to use it the best that we can. And thanks to you people, I suppose, we're doing that. And what this is showing you is our water consumption over time, and the red line at the top is the average pumpage per day. So what's striking about this is that in 2007, we were averaging roughly 52 million gallons a day, and we're just now getting to that, so almost 13 years later. And think about that. We've added essentially the town of Cary to our service area practically in terms of population, and we're still using the same amount of water. Now, as a utility, we get no tax money, not a dollar. In fact, we send money over to the general fund. So we plan on people using water. In fact, we joke about it that when we have plenty of it, we wish you would use lots of water because that's revenue for us. We get all of our revenue from water and sewer sales. So that changed our whole financial picture for a long time, because if you see that red line earlier, going back to the late 90s or so, we always planned for a little bit of growth in demand, 1-2%, and all of a sudden it went flat. Heck, we dropped it. And we had a drought in 2007, so we expected a little bit of drop, but it never really rebounded given the population increase that we've had every year. So we've adjusted to that, and now the beauty of that is that it buys you time until you need the new reservoir. When I started with Raleigh Water, we were going to have to go build Little River now. Like, it was going to have to be under construction now, and it's pushed off our 10-year CIP. We don't even think about it right now. So that's an incredible accomplishment. It's like me. I'm cheap with cars. I want to drive my car till the wheels fall off, rather than buy a new one every 5 years. So this allows us to drive that car for a lot longer. And the blue bars represent the average amount of water people use per day. Now, that's not a residential number. That's a gross number. But that's one of the lower numbers you're going to see. And so on average, the person here in Raleigh uses, I think it's 88, something around that, million gallons per day. Of that, the average person uses probably about half of it for residential uses. The rest of it's going to be commercial and things like that. But we also, here in Raleigh, we're a little bit different in that people come into Raleigh who don't live here. A lot of people live in Johnson County, come in here to work, and then they leave. But when they're here, they use water, they flush toilets, that business that they work at uses water. And so we don't get to count them from a population standpoint, but they're using our water and then leaving. So it's probably even a more impressive accomplishment than what I'm showing there. terms of quality, our most important asset is Falls Lake. That gets about 80% of our water, and you may know that Falls Lake has been challenged from a water quality standpoint with chlorophyll A, which is an algae. And algae can cause a lot of water quality issues. You can have fish death, taste and odor issues, and actually the drinking water itself. So it's a big deal. So back in 2006, we created a program called the Upper Neuse Clean Water Initiative, which was a preemptive program before there was any regulatory demands on anybody to do anything in terms of protecting Falls Lake. And the program is designed to go find property in the Falls Lake Basin, acquire that property, use a lot of partners, open space programs with other counties. Raleigh only has about maybe 1% of its own watershed in its own jurisdiction. So it's kind of strange in that way. We can't really control what happens in our own watershed. And maybe 10% of it is in Wake County. So we have to work with other counties, Durham County, Granville County, Person County, to try to protect our water source. And what's interesting is they don't get water from it, so there's just not a natural synergy there. So we go around and we find undeveloped tracts of land that has creeks, riparian areas, important ecological elements to water quality, and we conserve those in perpetuity. And so that's one of the ways that we try to protect this from future development. If anybody here is from New York City specifically, they have, generally speaking, fantastic water, which the people think, oh, they get it out of the Hudson. It's like, no. The water comes from the Catskills. And New York City had the foresight many, many, many years ago to buy a lot of property around there and discourage development. So that water, for a long time, they just put chlorine in it and called it good. It's shocking. And so for a long time, as a Southerner, I didn't believe it. Like, pizza's better up there and the bagels are better, but it's true. They have great water there, and that's because they protected their watershed. So we're trying to catch up to that. We're probably, Durham has obviously grown a lot, and Creedmoor and the communities have too, but we're trying to do our share here. And this is actually a little bit of a dated slide, but this is kind of summarizing what the program has accomplished so far. We're now actually over 100 properties protected in the watershed. I think we're over 8,000 acres. And the important piece that you'll see there is that we're protecting it from phosphorus and nitrogen. And those are essentially nutrients, i.e. food for algae. That's what algae eat. They love nitrogen and phosphorus. So the way we try to look at this metric is, instead of a housing development going on this 300-acre tract, which is almost invariably what's going to happen to it at some point. It might not happen today, might happen 10 years from now, but it'll probably happen. We've avoided that nutrient load to the city, excuse me, to the lake. So we think it's a great way, and we've leveraged a lot of money from the state and other grant funding partners. So it's basically a 10-to-1 funding ratio. And if you ever bother to look at your utility bill, so first of all, as someone with Raleigh Water, it's people call it the water bill, but it's really a combined utility bill. So you see water charges, infrastructure replacement charges, sewer charges, solid waste, recycling, stormwater. They're all on there. So it's not just the water bill, it's a lot of things. But also on there, there'll be a watershed protection fee, and it's 15 cents per 1,000 gallons of water used. So that's how we fund this program, and we think it's a really good way to protect our watershed. And this map is the other piece of the stool here, is infrastructure. Raleigh is actually a very old city, especially the downtown corridor. We have pieces on Wilmington Street of water lines that were over 100 years old and still in operation today. Oddly enough, a lot of the very, very old stuff is in fantastic shape because it was overbuilt. It was massively, it wasn't really engineered at all. It was just like, well, if a little's good, a lot's better. So we've gone through those lines, cleaned them and lined them with concrete on the inside, but structurally they're in great shape. After World War II, when things got engineered, I'm an engineer, so it hurts my feelings to say that, it got light and crappy is the best way to say it. We had a lot of cast iron that's just very brittle, falls apart very quickly. Put it in concrete, seemed like a great idea in the 60s. Turns out sewer gas eats it up like an inch a day, and so that was a bad idea. But we have a lot of old infrastructure in the downtown corridor. On the bright side, the green stuff that you see there is most of Raleigh's extant areas of water distribution is pretty new. Most of Raleigh grew in the 80s and 90s, and so you hope to get 100 years of life out of a given piece of buried infrastructure. So that's in good shape. But the downtown area, red, like NC State football team bass defense, is very bad. And so we're having to do a lot of projects now. They're very disruptive. Like the Crabtree sewer pipeline along the Crabtree Greenway, we've had that greenway closed for a long time. And it's just a real difficult thing to do, is try to dig up old lines in the middle of a very highly developed area. But we're doing that, and I think that's, as disruptive as it is necessary to make sure that we're reliable, because ultimately that's what we try to do. Is, I ask people, like, when's the last time your power went out, your cable went out, or whatever it is, and they can always say, a month or two ago. But with water, when's the last time you didn't have water? And usually, it's never. That's the goal. It's never out. You'll have some small outages here and there, but if you don't pay attention to this, you're going to have a lot of outages. And unfortunately, it's expensive. Our 10-year CIP is $1.7 billion. So we're having to replace a lot of old infrastructure, and hopefully after I'm retired and gone, we'll get to North Raleigh. And that's just this is just an example of what we're doing to ramp up our pipe replacement. Water and sewer, by and large, is a invisible utility. You usually see power lines, you see a lot of other infrastructure, roads, bridges, but you don't think about water and sewer, and it ages like everything else. So we've got to replace it, and that's what we've been doing to make sure that it's reliable and that it'll remain that way moving forward. And I could confidently say that we're ahead of most places in the country. Most of them, this is a coming crisis in my mind, that they're not replacing things as fast as they should, and they're just fixing things when they can, but they're not doing it in a preemptive way, and that's what we're doing here. So again, if you look at your utility bill, there's an infrastructure replacement fee on there, and it's $7 or $8 a month. That's what it's going to is to repair this infrastructure. So I think that's all I had. So I will be glad to take questions.
Thank you very much. So the way Q&A will work is I have a microphone, Katie has a microphone. Wave at us, we'll move the microphones around the room, and make sure that if you ask a question or we start a dialogue, that you talk into the microphone so that everybody can hear.
Enjoyed the program immensely.
Thank you.
Quick question. I know that our water supply, you're going to have to replenish it, as you said, some years in advance. What is the issue about not drawing water from Gaston?
Lake Gaston?
Yeah.
It's a good question. Partly, it's the same things I mentioned earlier about Cape Fear Basin and the Neuse Basin. We don't like moving water out of basins, and that's in a different river basin. And also the other complicating factor is that it's half of it or more is in Virginia. And when it comes to water supply, states, cities, counties are like little children, and they're very possessive of their water. And so they're not eager to give any of it up. That being said, there was, I don't know, I think 20 or 30 years ago, there was a situation where they provided water, and still to this day, to Virginia Beach. I'm jealous. I would, because really, as a crow flies, that's about an hour away, about 60 miles, and we looked at that. That was a possibility. I guess the issue is the expense. Is you'd have to get the water down here, then you have to put it back probably. And that's where it gets expensive, is pumping it back uphill. But the old saying in the water business is water runs to money. So if you want to pay enough, it's possible. And anything's on the table eventually. Good question.
Nice talk. Very interesting. One thing that I'm not from Raleigh, so I've never seen a Raleigh bill, but the thing that you brought up about the bill being entirely a utility bill and not having to do with government service, can you explain a little bit about how the utility and the government services interact? Who controls what? Who has say over what? Things like that. And secondarily, how do or did the smaller cities fund their water systems in the past that you had to take over?
So when you look at a utility bill, just look at the water and sewer charges and just pay those. Really, that's all that matters. It's a great question, and in some places they don't put all of those services on the utility bill. For instance, some communities put their solid waste services on your taxes. But the reality is, a lot of and stormwater is another one of these that people generally balk at paying. But the issue with the utility bill is that if you don't pay it, we turn your water off. And that's it's a lot of leverage. So a lot of communities prefer that system that we have here. But essentially, our side of it, the water and sewer side of it, we're a standalone enterprise fund, one of the few in the city. Again, we don't get any tax revenue. It's all water and sewer sales. And then the other one's stormwater. I can't remember the exact percentage, but they get some tax revenue. But they also are getting some revenue from the utility bill on our bill. Based on, I think, the impervious surface of a given property is how they're getting some revenue as well. And solid waste, I think, is moving closer and closer to becoming a standalone utility itself. Again, we bill for them, and so now when you call our number, you can talk to somebody that can talk to you about stormwater, solid waste, and this and that. But it's a little confusing because of our regional system, and this segues into your second part of your question, because we don't do the stormwater and solid waste for Garner. We send them utility bills, send their customers utility bills, but there's not solid waste on it. They cover that, however, and they might usually hire out a third-party contractor. But a lot of the small systems, some of them were already bulk customers of ours. We already sold water to them, and it was a truly difficult conversation for a lot of the small communities. When you agree to give away your water and sewer utility, that is because they don't get to vote. They have no real pull at our city council. So they're giving away their quote-unquote their future. So we've promised them a certain amount of capacity over time that they're guaranteed to have. Each one of them's got a little different deal. And they tend to be very optimistic about how much water they're going to use. They're like, well, we'll be the next Cary, and it hasn't happened yet. But they've been paying for that capacity every month, even if they're not using it. So ultimately, I think a lot of those leaders would say this was a good deal for those smaller systems because they have the benefit of the economy of scale now that they didn't have before. But other communities, I'm at a loss. I really, there was some legislation recently that was posed right over there on Jones Street that said we're going to charge every utility customer in North Carolina, I think, $2 a month to go into a fund to help pay for infrastructure needs at these small communities. They went over like a lead balloon, as you might imagine, but it means that they're thinking about it and they recognize that it's an issue.
I had two questions. One is, if they built another waste treatment plant that fed into the same river, it comes out of Lake Jordan, then could they use Lake Jordan as a water supply? And the second question is, about 20 years ago, they had like a bus tour to all the different utility functions in Raleigh. Do y'all see that happening anytime soon?
I would love to be a bus tour person. That's what I want to be as a retired person. I might write that idea down. That'd be great. Because there's a lot of other cool stuff. The solid waste center is really neat. The recycling center is cool. We think the water plant's pretty cool. And actually, the wastewater plant is really neat. Wastewater is actually harder than water. Costs about twice as much to deal with. So regarding your question about Lake Jordan and wastewater treatment, it's already happening. In fact, we have, as a new water source in the future, what we may do is take treated wastewater and send it to our Garner water treatment plant, treat it again, and then send it back. Put it this way, Durham discharges their wastewater into Falls Lake and Lake Jordan. So we're already downstream, everybody's downstream of somebody. And let's see, is it Johnson County or Clayton, I can't remember which one, their river intake is, 15 miles downstream of our main wastewater treatment plant. During the drought of 2007, over 50% of the water coming into their plant was our treated wastewater. So that's essentially what I would consider direct potable reuse. And so it's already happening. It's been happening for a long time. And as a little side note, the city got sued in the 1920s by Smithfield because we didn't have a wastewater plant. We didn't have one until the mid-50s, believe it or not. So if you lived here prior to that, when you flushed the toilet, it went to Crabtree Creek and then to the Neuse River untreated. So Smithfield sued us. Like, we have a water system here downstream of you guys, and you're not treating your wastewater. Went to court, and the judge ruled in our favor. Like, wastewater's so expensive. They sued us again, then they won. But so that a lot of things have changed. But now waste treatment is just leaps and bounds better than it ever has been. And if I had a glass of treated wastewater beside me, you couldn't tell the difference by looking at it.
Yeah, when I was in high school, which was a long time ago, somebody had written over the urinal, "Please flush, Smithfield needs water."
That's a classic, yep.
Okay, in your opinion, what is the best materials to use to build a sewer line, a water line that won't decay or deteriorate or be affected by gas?
It's not concrete, I can tell you that much. So she's asking what material is best for a water and sewer line, and normally we specify ductile iron pipe, but we've been experimenting with some different stuff in very small sections. Believe it or not, I'll say this. The old folks kind of knew what they were doing. Sewer systems used to be built with vitreous clay pipe. It's like that orange pipe you see for flowering pots. It's inert, so sewer gas has no effect on it at all. Problem with it is it's pretty fragile, and it requires perfect bedding to really set up right and not leak like crazy. If you remember the water main break we had up at Briar Creek a couple days ago, snarled traffic there for a while up on Highway 70 in Briar Creek. It wasn't a piece of pipe that failed per se. It was incorrectly installed. It was ductile iron pipe, and the bedding wasn't right, and so at the joint it kind of collapsed, and over time it had a leak. But ductile iron is usually what we see now. There's also some really good plastic materials that last a long time, but the problem with those things is it's all about how it's installed, because they don't have a lot of strength. You can walk on them and they can kind of depress. So ductile iron is, maybe I'm old school, but it's still my preferred material.
Yeah, because I remember before the Falls of Neuse Dam was built, I went to the heart of old Wake Forest Road where Manil Street comes out of Wake Forest to the car wash there now, where we planted bushes on that ground. But I remember how we used to get flooded, and sometimes I remember I used an old door that had been left in the parking lot to trash to work my way with an old broomstick to the dumpster to take out trash. Sometimes we'd be walking in water inside the store.
Wow.
Hi, Ed. Back in '05, when I moved out here, they told us they told us that there was maybe a month's worth of water. And me being an Arizona gal and us all into conservation of water, I just couldn't fathom being on the East Coast and running out of water. And now I hear you say that you're kind of low on the table again. do you have any plans, or have you been doing any campaigns for information on water conservation? You know, they even had commercials on the TV telling us how to wash our hair, to, you know, turn off the water and suds up and then turn it on to rinse.
So it's a great question about drought management, and our plan that I haven't told anybody about is to go to Lake Gaston. No, I was kidding. So things in 2000, there was 3 successive droughts, one in 2001, 2005, 2007. And that changed how we think about water here, at least in Raleigh. And I would say in the Southeast in general. The Southeast is generally blessed, as she said, with a lot of water. It rains 47 so inches a year. 59 last year, which was nuts, compared to, that's more than Seattle by a fair margin. Now again, that's on average. And during 2007 is the drought of record to date. That was 35 inches of rain. At the time, we had a director who was not from Arizona, but from Utah. And he said, shoot, a drought, you have 36 inches, you have 3 feet of rain come out of the sky. You don't even have a drought here. You've never had a drought here. You think you do. What you have is a drought of storage. You need bigger storage. And that's, now, quite frankly, he's no longer with us, so I can say this. I would disagree on that point, because in the western part of the country, they manage water very differently than we do here. And they have much bigger reservoirs, and they use snowpack and all those other things. But in 2005, we didn't have Lake Basin online. We do now. That's a huge benefit to us. At that time, in 2005, Falls Lake was our only source, and we were one of the largest, if not the largest population on one water source, which, drought aside, if you had a failure at a water plant or a raw water transmission main, that's an awkward discussion to have on television about not having water for 500,000 people. So we now have Lake Basin online, and when they say that you have 30 days remaining, to this day I despise how they describe that, because it's a kind of an archaic measurement of water volume. It says if your water consumption stays at a pretty high level and it doesn't rain a drop for 30 days, you could theoretically run out of water. And even so, there's more water in Falls Lake in the sediment pool that hasn't filled up, thankfully, that we could have gotten water from. So it was dire, and it was a serious situation. My preference would be able to erect giant water stoplights around the city and say, you know what, we got plenty of water, please use it. It helps with water quality. There's times in the middle of the night we have to dump water on the ground because water can't stay in a line but for a couple days. Then it loses chlorine residual, and we got to dump it. So and now our irrigation demand has dropped off to nothing. There's positives to that. Negative is we don't have that water quality turning over like we used to. And then you get in a dry spell, you put a yellow light on, it's like try to knock down your water consumption. And then you're in a real drought, you put on the red light. But that's not the way it works. And what we've seen is that people really haven't recovered that much from water conservation policies in 2007. So to answer the young lady's question, we don't feel a need to actually send that message out anymore, because people apparently are already doing it. And the social experiment was that once you've cut back and you've changed your irrigation habits, your showering habits, your washing habits, you don't go back. And then we've had significant rate increases on top of that. That also, there's a price elasticity piece of that will depress water consumption. So we feel like we're actually using less water every year per capita. So it's been useful in terms of long-term water planning, but she mentioned it's been dry here recently. The lake is, I checked it this morning, is about a little under 6-7 inches down below full pool. That is shocking for September. September is generally a dry month. I've lived here all my life, and it can be very dry for a couple of weeks. So it wouldn't be unusual for that lake to be down 3 feet right now. We wouldn't even blink at it, quite frankly. That's why you build lakes, so you can manage through dry spells and not have to ring the alarm bell every time. But then there is a time when we will have a drought, and it will be significant at some point. So the question was, we have an online tool to see how much water we're using. We're actually working on that. I think Cary may have that. They have a AMI, a smart metering system that can maybe show you like real-time water consumption, and we're getting there. But we got 200,000 meters to replace, so it takes us a little while.
You mentioned about the stormwater runoff is not treated. I live in St. Augustine, Florida, on a river. In the last part of it, the last piece of that river, that oysters can be harvested because of the runoff and pollutants from fertilizer and other stormwater kind of runoff. Is there any, what's the future in that?
Don't eat the oysters.
Yeah.
And I love oysters. So you ask about stormwater treatment and how it impacts the environment. We are looking at stormwater differently as a city. When I was in engineering school a long time ago, stormwater was about, we need to get this water off the road so we can drive cars. Now there's a huge quality element to it. So now you'll see, if you see a new development, you'll see a pond off to the side usually. That's a detention pond to hold that water, you get some settling. And the other piece to that is what happens when you have a lot of impervious surface. It just blasts through the pipes, goes to the creeks, and it's hitting the sides, the banks of the creeks at 25, 30 feet per second, and which the creeks weren't quote unquote designed for, and it erodes them like crazy. But still, stormwater isn't treated nearly like wastewater. Everybody thinks, oh, gross sewer stuff, and yes, when you have a sewer spill, it's terrible, but that is highly treated by the time it leaves our treatment plant. And in general, stormwater is getting very crude treatment. And I got into a debate about a guy that has, this is Cleveland, I think. They have a combined sewer system. So they were celebrating the fact that that's 50 years since the river caught on fire. I didn't know you could celebrate that, but they did. And they had a combined sewer system. So which that means is that under normal conditions, when it's not raining, that sewer goes to a treatment plant. And then when it rains, there's still a lot of that water that goes to the treatment plant, but also a lot of it just goes straight to a creek, raw sewage like it did in 1955 here. I was stunned at that because whenever we have a sewer spill, it's a big deal, and we got to go clean it and everything like that. And they had a little video of it just kind of going to a creek, and they were like, "Look at that!" And I was like, "That's amazing." That's legal, but. No, but Raleigh is, that stormwater fee is going to go pay for stormwater projects. And Raleigh, quite frankly, in my estimation, their stormwater fee is actually pretty low. If you look at DC Water, for instance, that's the water utility for Washington, D.C., they're projected, because they're a combined water and sewer, so their stormwater goes into their sewers. Their projected rates are, again, approaching that 150 mark. It's incredible. And that's, as an aside, whenever you see these movies, which I'm stunned they do this, they have a lot of movies, if you look at them, they're in a sewer system. And they're never like, they're in an underground sewer system like in Rome or Paris or wherever. And they look kind of pretty, but it's still sewage. And they're just walking around in there, and so don't do that. But we don't have that here. Ours are all much smaller.
I understand that Cary has something in their infrastructure they call gray water. I don't really understand that, but are there advantages and disadvantages for Raleigh considering that?
Why has it got to be Cary? So we also have something like that, and I would say, quite frankly, more advanced. At least it's bigger. Gray water technically is water that you would collect at a house. Let's say you could plumb your washing machine to a rain barrel, and then you can use that to, it's not really dirty, and then you can use that to water a garden. That's gray water, or the sink water, something like that. What Cary and Raleigh have is something called reuse water, or otherwise known as reclaimed water. It's just highly treated wastewater. Instead of sending it into the river, we'll send it back to a distribution system. and they'll use it for non-potable things. In our case, we give it to golf courses for irrigation. Wake Med has it for cooling tower water, which is cool because I'll be there tomorrow. And they use it for things like that. The downside is we're retroactively building a third utility, a reuse distribution system, whereas we'd have thought about it 50 years ago, we could have put those lines in then rather than having to go back and try to install them now. Lonnie Pool, NC State's physical plant, also uses a lot of water. We use about 1.2 million gallons of water a day for reuse purposes, which saves water from the potable side.
One of the interesting things you said was that the water and sewer systems are invisible, and that makes an education problem. But I wanted to ask about an aspect of the water system that is occasionally visible, and that is the stormwater that has been talked about here. In the central part of the city, the stormwater system has proven, at least at certain points, to be inadequate. And when there's a good rain, you get a lot, the stormwater system can't deal with it. I'm wondering if, though this may not be in your portfolio, if you know how good the progress has been in the central part of the city on improving the stormwater infrastructure, and also what kind of planning is being done for the increase in stormwater that's likely as the climate changes?
We're going to stick our head in the sand and hope it doesn't happen. Great questions, and unfortunately stormwater is not my specific area of expertise, but I do work with those folks quite a bit. Downtown is a big focus point of what they're doing. However, as I had waxed poetically earlier about the age of some of the downtown water and sewer lines, they've got a lot of old stormwater pipes in there that are vastly undersized for what I would consider modern rainfall events that are, in the magnitude of 4 to 5 inches in 2 hours or something. And so they do have plans to expand culverts to allow more flow. They've been doing that. They've also, not that this is addressing the problem directly, but they've got a neat little tool that shows you where areas are flooding, kind of basically real time. There's cameras now that we have stream flow gauges just recently installed that can give us real-time data on, like, okay, problem areas that we see with flooding, Wake Forest Road and Atlantic Avenue and places like that. So we can give people a heads up that you're going to be hydroplaning if you try to go through there. But I don't have a good answer. It's just a hard problem to deal with because we are getting a lot of rain that I don't think we've, in intensities we hadn't seen before, and we've got a lot of old infrastructure. But again, I think the stormwater folks recognize that and are investing now in the downtown area. It's just taking a long time to catch up.
Thanks for all the great information. But you haven't really addressed what's being treated, like how the water's being treated to clean and disinfect, and has anything else been added to the water? Like, for instance, I know a lot of communities fluoridate. Is Raleigh fluoridating currently?
Yes.
Okay. Why is that?
So I'll hit the treatment part first and then jump on the fluoride in a second. So I didn't, for sake of time, I didn't get it too far down to the treatment piece of it. Water treatment has been going on a long time, and it's incredibly important. Most people don't recognize it, take it for granted that one of the biggest advancements in public health is fluoridated water. Waterborne diseases still kill more people every year than anything else, period. 3.4 million people. My 9-year-old daughter was asking about what is cholera? Unknown to a modern person in the United States, but very much known in other places in the world. That doesn't happen here. We've addressed that basically at the turn of the 20th century. Since then, we've advanced quite a long ways in terms of water treatment. As I mentioned, New York City used to just basically put some chlorine in it and call it good. Now we use, the first step is settling out the solids. There's suspended solids. If you go to Falls Lake and Lake Jordan, it's not crystal clear. If you go to like a glacial lake, which I recommend, they're beautiful, you can see down to the bottom like a pool. We don't have that advantage. We have a lot of organic material in that water column. So we have to settle that out, and that's usually just done by adding a polymer. It makes the particles get heavy, stick together, and they sink. Then the top column of that water is very clean. Then really the next piece of it is putting it through a filter, which is not that different than a Brita filter. Just different materials, different media, sand, erythrosite, which is a type of coal, and that gets anything that we missed in the settling process. And then in our case, we use ozone, and ozone is an oxidizer, so that can break up different types of compounds that cause odor issues, or even things, you know, like caffeine, acetaminophen, things like that. We can now see that in our water, our raw water. We can test down to parts per trillion now, so we can see, you know, estrogen, all sorts of these compounds that have been in the water for, you know, 60, 70 years, but now we can actually see it. And then the next step is arguably, in my opinion, the most important, is disinfection. So we used to use just chlorine. We now, I know this sounds great, but we add ammonia to it to form something called chloramines. And chloramines are really great because they're neutral taste. They don't taste and smell like pool water. And they stay in the water for a long, long, long time. They don't break down very easily. So they're very effective disinfectant, and all the systems now that I know of use that. But it's also why every other year now, in our case, we switch back in March through April to what we call free chlorine. We go back to old school and use just chlorine because the nice term is the biofilm on the inside of a water line, which is basically biological material on the inside of the water line, gets resistant. You know, it's kind of like any other bug. So we switch it up on them and go with chlorine, and it just smokes them. And so we used to do it have to do it once a year, but we lobbied with the state, and we were the first system in North Carolina to be able to move that to twice a year. Now Cary and others have followed suit. So after the disinfection part, technically that water is safe to drink and ready to go. What we also do, and to his point, we add fluoride. And from a water provider standpoint, we don't really care one way or the other. It's actually the nastiest chemical that we work with. So, I mean, I think if you ask some of our guys, they'd rather not do it. But we got some requests to get fluoride out of the water a few years ago, and the State Health Department and the American Dental Association showed up en masse to City Council, and they provided, at least in their eyes, an incredible amount of information that shows that the rate of cavities, especially in children, since fluoridated water was introduced in the United States, has dropped dramatically, and that we would be foolish to go the other way. I don't have a position on it one way or the other, but that's what's happened in Raleigh.
Okay, yeah, my concern is that what's the source of fluoride that you use? If that's an awful that you don't want to mess with?
I think it's I can't pronounce it very well. It's like fluorosilicic acid.
Hydrofluorosilicic acid.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's corrosive, right? Where do you get that from? A chemical company? Right?
I can't remember the exact name of the company that we get it from, and I know that the limit at which is acceptable has gone down. I think at one time the EPA said 4 parts per million was the maximum level, and now it's down to 2. We've always been at the lower end of the scale.
So the EPA, they limit that as as pollution, right? Fluoride, they're limiting that as a contaminant, just like it is on the Raleigh water report.
Right, just like chlorine is a contaminant.
Okay. So
Yeah.
I'm with cleanwaterraleigh.org for those of you that are interested in this. Fluoride is a neurotoxin, okay? It's shown just a few weeks ago, a study came out that it shows that women that are pregnant drinking fluoride reduces the IQ of their babies, okay? This is not just the first study of its kind. There have been other studies like that. It's linked 50-plus studies to neurological cognitive damage, people that use, not just people studies, but animal studies, showing that reduced IQ, cognitive abilities. There's links with Alzheimer's, dementia, cancer. In fact, Dean Burke, he was a 34-year veteran of the National Cancer Institute, said that cancer without exception, like causes more cancer and causes it faster than any other chemical. Fluorine is one of the most reactive chemicals in the periodic table. And the acid, the hydrofluorosilicic acid, that it interacts with the chloramines that you use to leach the lead out of the water. So I urge everybody to go to cleanwaterraleigh.org and also fluoride, Fluorid, alert.org to learn more about this, because this is...
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and pass
Thank
the
you.
mic. I've only got a couple more minutes left for questions.
Going back to the gray water issue, and the same way that they have put in the new developments, they've put the electric lines underground. As Raleigh was developing, would it have been a good idea to start that in the new developments?
For gray water?
Yeah. I can understand not going back in town and doing all that, but as places, you know, the new developments, would it not have been a thing to do?
So that was something that we thought about. We had a master plan done in 2007 and had kind of envisioned expanding that distribution system, recognizing that even then a lot of the residential growth and greenfield development in Raleigh has kind of been over. But not long after that, our city council decided that that was not a wise use of expenditures because that water would be used for irrigation, some other stuff that we were seeing a lot of drop in demand for. And so they asked us to look at using it for an alternative water source. And that's, I mentioned earlier that we've created some legislation that we had passed 5 or 6 years ago that would allow us to pilot test bringing that reuse water to a water treatment plant. And that in my estimation is sort of the holy grail of water resource management. But you know, in some communities, I would say out west, that idea is probably a lot more prevalent.
Hi.
Hey.
One question about your mandates and who tells you guys what to do. My home is in the path of the southern loop of 540, and I have a creek that goes around 2 sides, and the creek floods with all the new rains that we have and the heaviness. And I had the hydrologist come to my property and tell me that they had run the numbers and my house does not flood, even though I've stood in it, and yes, it floods. So they offline told me that the current regime has told them that they are not to use any of the climate numbers from the past 30 years when they are designing the new avenue of 540. Have you guys been given any kind of direction like that?
No, especially not as it applies to 540. But what we do look at, and I was speaking to Chris about this before the evening, is when I look at water supply, long-term water supply, how does potential climate change affect us? And as a water provider, we would be foolish not to think about in those terms, simply put. I mean, we can have, you know, political, ideological arguments about it, but we don't have that luxury. We have to assume kind of the worst case scenario. So there was, EPA created a climate change model that was very scalable. It can kind of predict what your weather patterns would look like in a given area. And so we took that into consideration. And whenever we built our drought model, we used something called OASIS, and it's a hydrologic model of the entire watershed. So it looks at every withdrawal, every discharge. It looks at 86 years of record in terms of inflows and drought events. So we looked at that and then developed a drought trigger system on when we should start really pushing for conservation and also think about when that should push us towards another water source. And what we did was we looked at some of the old data, and honestly we felt like the last, I think it was 1925 to the 70s, was not necessarily representative of what we were going to see moving forward. So we looked at kind of like pushing that out. And we said that the last 30 years is probably closer to what we'll see moving forward, and then we're going to layer in some more variability, if you will. So we created like Frankenstein droughts. We kind of made them up, and I'm not going to lie, there's a little bit of swag to it because we don't truly know. But we took that into consideration to make sure that we are resilient. And we also, I would add, that shockingly, we've just recently been able to create interconnections with all of our utility partners. That we were closed, and in some cases we had some connections we hadn't looked at in a long time. But I had to go in front of the camera in 2007 and said, hey, if Raleigh runs out of water, can you get water from Cary? And I was like, next question. Because we didn't really know. And so now we have a partnership with all of our local utilities, and we do it for just this sort of thing, about trying to become more resilient. And we actually test it now. We actually open up valves, see if it works. We designed it. We think it'll work. And then, like we said, we could get 9 million gallons from Cary at Crossroads. Turns out we can only get 4. Truthfully, we were designed to give water to everybody else. We were originally designed to provide water to Cary, and then they decided to go their own way. So everything was kind of angled to go the other way, but now we've addressed that, and we can get water from Johnson County, from Durham, from Cary, and we can sort of wheel water between systems. So we're much more resilient than we were. But yeah, we do look at that sort of thing.
Let's give Ed one more round of applause. Thanks for coming out. I don't know, but I get a good feeling when I've learned something and I know more than I did before the show started, right? Just knowing more makes me feel good. I don't know about y'all, but that makes me feel good. So I hope it makes you feel good. Good enough maybe to come back next Thursday night, too. Next Thursday night will be the first Thursday of the month, which means it's science trivia night. So bring your team, come out, get dinner and drinks here in the cafe, compete in science trivia. It's going to be a lot of fun. There's prizes, there's bragging rights, there's bad jokes. It'll be great. We'll see you next Thursday night here at Science Trivia for the Science Cafe. Good night, everybody.